late at night, in an ordinary American kitchen. The house has gone quiet. The lights are low. The counters are still. And inside a cabinet sits a small collection of things that hardly seem worth noticing. Black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, paprika. A pepper grinder rests near the stove. A jar of cinnamon waits for oatmeal, coffee, or a warm apple pie, somewhere in the back. A container of nutmeg may have been sitting untouched since last Thanksgiving. Today, these spices are cheap, familiar, and easy to replace. We buy them without thinking about where they came from or how far they traveled. Yet for most of human history, they were anything but ordinary. Pepper once crossed oceans and deserts before reaching a European table. Cinnamon passed through the hands of merchants who guarded its origins like a secret. Cloves and nutmeg came from distant tropical islands that many buyers could not even place on a map. Kings wanted them. Merchants built fortunes around them. Sailors crossed dangerous seas in search of them. Entire trade routes grew around the movement of bark. Seeds, roots, berries, and dried flower buds. So how did such small things become some of the most desired objects in history? To understand that, we have to go back thousands of years, to a world before spice routes, before great merchant fleets, and before anyone could imagine how far the simple desire for flavor would eventually carry humanity. Long before there were kingdoms, merchant fleets, or roads joining distant cities, there was fire. For early humans, fire changed life. It offered warmth and protection, but it also transformed food. Meat could be roasted, tough roots softened, and seeds warmed until their flavor changed. We do not know who first added an aromatic plant to a meal. There was no single inventor of seasoning, no forgotten cook whose name can be recovered. The discovery was probably made many times, in many places, by people learning slowly from the landscapes around them. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers returning to camp near sunset. Meat is placed over a fire. Someone brings leaves from a plant already known to be safe. Perhaps the leaves are wrapped around the meat, or perhaps a few simply fall onto the hot stones. As they warm, their oils rise into the air, and the familiar smell of roasting food changes. It becomes sharper, sweeter, more fragrant. Someone notices. Elsewhere, another discovery waits beneath the soil. A root has a biting warmth when chewed. A small seed seems plain until it is crushed between stones, releasing an aroma far stronger than its size suggests. A piece of bark smells different when dried beside the fire. Human beings had thousands of years to experiment. The landscape was a vast living pantry, but also a dangerous one. Some plants nourished, others poisoned. Some soothed pain, flavored food, or became part of ceremonies. Children learned which berries were safe. Gatherers remembered where roots appeared after the rains, and elders passed this knowledge onward. Long before recipes were written down, traditions of flavor survived through memory. The boundary between food, medicine, and ceremony was not always clear. A fragrant seed might season a meal and later be burned as an offering. A bitter root might be valued for its taste and also for a healing power people believed it possessed. Aromatic smoke could fill a shelter with a pleasant scent while carrying a deeper spiritual meaning. This is where the history of spices becomes much older than the spice trade. Today, we usually call seeds, fruit, bark, roots, and flower buds spices, while leafy parts are more often called herbs. Ancient communities needed no such neat categories. What mattered was whether a plant was fragrant, useful, storable, or worth carrying. Slowly, communities developed their own landscapes of flavor. One valley might know a pungent root growing near streams. Elsewhere, people prized aromatic seeds, berries, or fragrant bark unknown to their neighbors. At first, these flavors belonged to the places where they grew. And this is one of the most important ideas in our story. Spices began as local knowledge. Before pepper was weighed by merchants, it was a vine understood by people living where pepper grew. Before cinnamon reached distant markets, generations had learned which bark to harvest and how to dry it. Before cloves and nutmeg became objects of international desire, island communities already knew the trees, the seasons, and the work required to gather them. Then something simple began to change everything. People met other people. A neighboring community tasted an unfamiliar seed and wanted some to take home. Dried plants could be exchanged for stone, shells, hides, pottery, or other useful goods. At first, the distances were modest, a path through the hills, a river journey, a neighboring settlement. But a spice did not need one person to carry it across the world. It only needed each person to carry it a little farther. A seed could pass from one community to another, then onward again. A dried root might eventually reach people who had never seen the living plant. With distance came mystery, and with mystery came desire. In time, villages would become towns, and boats and traders would connect communities that had never met. Small exchanges along footpaths would grow into networks spanning seas and deserts. For now, however, the story remained close to the earth: a fire, a meal, a crushed seed, a fragrant leaf, and generations slowly learning the tastes around them. Far beyond those familiar landscapes, pepper vines were climbing through the wet forests of India. Cinnamon trees were growing beneath tropical rains. And, farther east, on small volcanic islands surrounded by warm seas, cloves and nutmeg were waiting. For centuries, these plants belonged to their own corners of the world, but they would not remain there forever. Now let the landscape change. Leave the open grasslands and cool northern forests behind, and travel toward tropical Asia, where heat, rain, and rich soil created some of the most valuable plants the world would ever know. Begin on the Malabar coast of southwestern India. Here the air is warm and heavy with moisture. Monsoon clouds gather over green hills. Rain darkens the soil, and vines climb the trunks of taller trees. Among them is black pepper. Pepper does not begin as the dry black bead we know from a kitchen grinder. It grows in clusters of small green fruits on a climbing vine. Farmers learn to guide those vines upward, using trees or supports to lift them toward filtered sunlight. The berries could be gathered and dried until their skins wrinkled and darkened. What remained was light, compact, durable, and intensely flavored. A small sack could carry enough pepper to season countless meals, and unlike fresh fruit or meat, it could survive a long journey. Move south across the water, and another landscape comes into view: Sri Lanka, the island once known to many outsiders as Ceylon. In its warm, wet country grew the trees that produced true cinnamon. The spice was not a fruit hanging conveniently from a branch. It came from bark. Harvesting it required knowledge and careful hands. Young stems were cut, the outer bark removed, and the fragrant inner layers loosened in thin strips. As those strips dried, they curled inward, forming the delicate quills we recognize as cinnamon sticks. The aroma was sweet and woody, unlike almost anything available in colder parts of the ancient world. Travel farther east, beyond India and across the great waters of Southeast Asia, and the geography becomes more scattered. Islands appear across warm seas, green and mountainous. some shaped by volcanoes. In the Maluku Islands grew the clove tree. A clove is easy to overlook. It is simply a flower bud, picked before the flower opens. Fresh buds begin pale, deepen in color, and are harvested and dried until they become the small brown spikes found in kitchens today. Yet crush one between the fingers and the reason for its fame becomes obvious. Its scent is powerful, warm, sweet, and sharp. A tiny amount can fill a room. And then there was nutmeg. Sail farther through eastern Indonesia to the Banda Islands, a tiny group of volcanic islands rising from the Banda Sea. For centuries, this remote place possessed something extraordinary. Nutmeg grew naturally there and nowhere else on Earth. The fruit itself can resemble a small apricot. When ripe, it splits open. Inside is a dark seed wrapped in a brilliant red, lace-like covering. The covering becomes mace. The seed becomes nutmeg, two spices, hidden inside one fruit. Other flavors were rooted across southern and southeastern Asia. Ginger grew underground in thick, branching rhizomes, storing its heat beneath the soil. Turmeric, another rhizome, offered an earthy flavor and a deep golden color that could stain fingers. Cloth and food. Cardamom produced small pods filled with aromatic seeds, prized in cooking and later carried into culinary traditions, stretching from India to the Middle East and beyond. A field of wheat could be planted across enormous stretches of Europe and Asia. Many valuable spices were different. Some flourished only in tropical environments. Others had natural ranges so narrow that, for centuries, the world depended on a handful of regions for its entire supply. This was the quiet beginning of scarcity. Imagine living in a Mediterranean city and wanting cloves when the nearest clove trees stood on islands thousands of miles away. You could not plant a few in your garden. You could not simply travel to the source. Between you and those trees lay oceans, deserts, languages, kingdoms, storms, and generations of merchants. Every mile added difficulty. Every exchange added cost. And every unanswered question about the spice's origin added mystery. The people who lived beside these plants understood them as crops, medicinas, foods, fragrance, and parts of local life. But once the spices began moving outward, their meaning changed. Distance transformed familiar plants into exotic goods. Rarity turned aroma into status. And the farther a spice traveled, the easier it became for stories to grow around it. Suan, pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, and aromatics from lands even farther east would begin appearing in places where no living pepper vine, cinnamon tree, or clove tree had ever been seen. No single merchant would carry them all the way. No single road would connect their forests to the distant markets that wanted them. Instead, the spices would move from hand to hand, boat to boat, village to village, slowly crossing a world far larger than any one traveler could easily understand. And once that movement began, the history of spices became something larger than the history of plants. It became the history of distance itself. Before, there were famous spice ports, imperial fleets, or merchants whose names survived in written records. Spices had already begun to move. Their first journeys were quieter. A handful of dried seeds might leave one village with a traveler. A root gathered in one landscape could appear, months later, in a place where no one had ever seen the living plant. By the second millennium before the Common Era, and probably earlier in some regions, communities across Asia, the Persian Gulf, Arabia, northeastern Africa, and the Mediterranean were linked by overlapping systems of exchange. There was no single spice road. no highway beginning in India and ending neatly in Egypt. Instead, trade worked in pieces. Imagine pepper or another aromatic product leaving a farming community in South Asia. There it is combined with textiles, beads, grain, timber, or other goods and taken toward the coast. He loads it aboard a vessel that follows familiar shores to another harbour. At that harbour, someone else purchases it, stores it, repacks it, and sends it onward. The people travel part of the route. The spice travels all of it. That simple pattern could connect places separated by astonishing distances. Goods moved through ports along the western coast of India and into the Arabian Sea. Some entered the Persian Gulf, where maritime traffic linked the ocean with Mesopotamia. Others moved towards southern Arabia and the Red Sea, where ships and coastal communities formed another bridge between the Indian Ocean and northeastern Africa. From there, cargo could continue overland by caravan, follow river systems, or be transferred again to vessels bound for Mediterranean markets. The journey was rarely smooth. Sailing depended on seasons, winds, and local knowledge. Overland travel meant heat, scarce water, toils, and animals that had to be fed. Cargo might wait weeks or months in a warehouse for the next stage of its journey. And yet, spices were unusually well suited to this difficult world. They were small. They could be dried. Many remained useful for long periods if protected from moisture. A ship did not need to devote an entire cargo hold to carry something valuable. A modest bundle could represent considerable wealth once it reached a distant market. Distance itself began to change the value of the object. The farther it moved from its source, the harder it became to replace, and the more remarkable it could seem. Near the place where a spice grew, people understood it as something familiar. They knew the plant, the harvest, the smell of it drying, perhaps even the families who cultivated it. Several exchanges later, that same spice had become something else. Buyers farther west might know its flavor, but have only a vague idea of its origin. They could not walk into the forest and gather more. They depended on the next merchant, the next caravan, the next ship. Each person in the chain had taken a risk. Each expected something in return. The farmer invested labor. Traders paid for transport and storage. Shipowners risked storms and loss. Caravan leaders crossed difficult country. Officials demanded taxes, and merchants added their own profit. By the time the spice reached its final buyer, its price carried the memory of the journey. This explains one of the great puzzles of spice history. Pepper was a berry. Cinnamon was bark. Cloves were flower buds. Their value came not only from what they were, but from where they grew, how badly distant consumers wanted them, and how difficult they were to move. The network carried more than spices. Ships and caravans moved textiles, metals, ivory, incense, timber, ceramics, and precious stones. With them came languages, stories, ideas, and rumors about places beyond the horizon. A port was a meeting point between worlds. Few participants understood the complete system. A merchant near the Persian Gulf might recognize an Indian product without ever visiting India. A Mediterranean buyer might purchase an aromatic whose original landscape existed for him mostly as rumor. There was only the next link: a harbor, a market, a desert crossing, a ship leaving with the season. Over generations, those links became stronger. Ports grew around reliable markets. Families accumulated knowledge about routes and prices. Sailors learned the seasons. Rulers learned to tax passing goods. Many small exchanges were becoming a vast commercial web, and somewhere inside that web, a remarkable transformation was taking place. A plant that might be ordinary near its source could arrive at the far end of the journey, wrapped in mystery and prestige. Soon, some of these distant aromatics would reach one of the richest civilizations of the ancient world. Along the Nile, people were already surrounding temples, palaces, medicinas, and the dead with fragrance. For them, scent could carry meanings far beyond taste. The spices were moving west. Egypt was waiting. By the time spices and aromatics began reaching the Nile Valley, Egypt had already built one of the ancient world's richest cultures of scent. Along the river, temples rose above crowded towns. Priests prepared offerings for the gods, and households burned fragrant materials whose smoke drifted through rooms and courtyards. Smell belonged to religion, medicina, beauty, status, and death. Egyptians used many substances from their own region or nearby lands. Frankincense and myrrh, resins gathered from trees in Arabia and northeastern Africa, were especially important. They could be burned in temples, mixed into perfumes, used in ointments, or placed among funerary goods. Other plant materials arrived through trade from farther away. Although the exact routes and dates are not always easy to reconstruct, that uncertainty matters. Ancient texts use names that do not always match modern botanical categories, and scholars still debate what some words described. Some materials once identified confidently as cinnamon or cassia may have been related aromatics, while other finds suggest that goods from South Asia or even farther east were reaching the Mediterranean world surprisingly early. The safest conclusion is that Egypt belonged to trade networks capable of bringing distant fragrances to the Nile. Imagine an elite household in Thebes or Memphis. A servant opens a small container of costly aromatic material. The owner may know its merchant name and perhaps the port from which it arrived. But the place where the plant actually grew might lie thousands of miles away. The Egyptian buyer has never seen the tree. He has never met the farmer. He does not know the language spoken where it was harvested. Yet the object is here. That is one of the quiet wonders of ancient trade. Long before anyone possessed a complete map of the world, goods connected people who knew almost nothing about one another. In Templars, fragrance had sacred power. Incense smoke could mark the boundary between ordinary space and ritual space. Perfumed oils were used to honor divine images and prepare people for ceremonies. In a hot climate, a controlled fragrance could also signal cleanliness, wealth, and order. Perfume making became a skilled craft. Oils were infused with flowers, herbs, resins, and spices, and the most expensive mixtures depended on substances that had traveled far. Medicine overlapped with the same world of aromatics. Egyptian medical texts describe preparations made from oils, plants, minerals, honey, wine, and resins. Some may have had practical effects. Others reflected beliefs about the body. Aromatic materials moved easily between the medicine chest, the dressing table, and the temple. They also followed Egyptians into death. The preservation of the dead required oils, resins, linen, salves, and careful ritual work. Fragrant substances could be applied to the body or included in burial preparations. They could mask odors, protect materials, and carry symbolic meaning connected with purification and the afterlife. Later writers described exotic spices in embalming, but historians must be careful not to place every famous spice in every period. What matters is the larger pattern. Aromatic substances were valuable because they were useful, beautiful, symbolic, and difficult to obtain. A resin from Arabia or a plant product from Asia arrived, carrying the cost of every journey behind it. Ships crossed dangerous water. Caravans moved through dry country. Merchants stored, guarded, and resold the cargo. Each stage added value. The result was a strange intimacy between distant worlds. A priest could burn a substance gathered by people he would never meet. A noblewoman could wear a perfume containing an ingredient from a landscape she could barely imagine. As demand grew, the network carrying these materials became more important. Ports along the Red Sea and Arabian coast connected with routes leading toward the Persian Gulf, South Asia, and the wider Indian Ocean. Inland, caravans linked those ports to the Nile and the Mediterranean. But there was a problem. The sea between these regions was vast, and sailing across it was not simply a matter of pointing a ship east or west. Winds changed with the seasons. A vessel leaving at the wrong time could spend weeks fighting the weather, or fail to return at all. To turn scattered exchanges into a dependable long-distance system, merchants and sailors had to learn how to read something invisible. They had to learn the wind. At dawn, the Indian Ocean can appear almost still. The horizon brightens slowly. The last stars fade, and a wooden vessel rises and settles on long. Gentle swells. Its sail hangs for a moment, then fills as warm air moves across the water. Somewhere behind it lies a familiar harbor. Ahead is a coastline the crew may not see for days or weeks. For the sailors who crossed this ocean in the ancient world, the sea was not an empty space. It had seasons. It had patterns. And, if you learned to recognize them, it had something almost like a rhythm. The most important rhythm was the monsoon. Today the word may suggest heavy rain, but for sailors it also meant a great seasonal change in the winds. During one part of the year, winds over much of the Indian Ocean tended to blow in one broad direction. Months later, they reversed. The change was not perfectly simple, and local conditions always mattered. But the pattern was reliable enough to shape long-distance travel. During the season of the southwest monsoon, winds could help carry vessels from the waters near Arabia and East Africa toward India. Later, when the northeast monsoon arrived, the direction changed, helping ships make the return journey west. For merchants, this transformed the ocean. A voyage no longer had to mean struggling endlessly against uncertain winds while remaining close to shore. Sailors who understood the seasons could plan departures around them. They could leave an Arabian harbor when the winds were favorable, cross open water toward the Indian coast, conduct business there, and wait for the winds to turn before sailing home. And waiting was part of the system. A merchant might arrive in a foreign port knowing that he would remain there for months. His ship would be unloaded. Pepper, textile, ivory, incense, timber, beads, ceramics, and other goods would pass through warehouses and markets. Repairs might be made to the hull. Water and food would be gathered for the return voyage. Sailors would hear unfamiliar languages in the streets and eat foods they did not know at home. Then, eventually, the season changed. The sail filled from another direction, and the harbor began to empty. This repeated movement connected an enormous world. Along the Arabian Peninsula, ports faced outward toward India and Africa. Across the sea, communities on the East African coast traded products from the African interior and received goods carried from Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. Indian ports linked inland farming regions with maritime commerce. Sri Lanka occupied a valuable position near major routes, while farther east, ships could continue toward the Malay Peninsula and the island worlds of Southeast Asia. No single people owned this ocean. Arab sailors were important. So were Indian merchants and mariners, Persian traders, Africans along the Swahili coast, Malay sailors, and many other communities whose names appear only faintly. if at all, in surviving records. Knowledge accumulated across generations. A captain learned from older sailors. A merchant family remembered which harbor offered the best price. Pilots knew reefs, currents, stars, coastlines, and places where fresh water could be found. The ocean was dangerous, but it was not unknowable. And once sailors learned its seasonal pulse, spices could move farther and more regularly than before. Pepper, harvested on the Malabar coast, could enter a port crowded with vessels from distant regions. Cinnamon and other goods from Sri Lanka could join cargoes moving west. Aromatics from Southeast Asia could travel through several maritime networks before reaching buyers who had never heard the names of the islands where they began. Again, the same principle remained true. Few people traveled the entire distance. The spice did. A merchant from India did not need to sail all the way to a Mediterranean city. He could sell to another trader. That trader could carry the cargo to Arabia. Someone else might move it toward the Red Sea. A caravan could take over on land. Another merchant might eventually place the same aromatic substance on a table thousands of miles from the tree or vine that produced it. With every transfer, the spice gathered cost and mystery. Ports became places where worlds overlapped. A harbor was not merely a place to load a ship. It could be a temporary home for strangers waiting on the wind. Foreign merchants needed lodging, food, interpreters, storage, in-credit, and local partners. Some stayed. Some married into local families. Religious ideas, stories, technologies, recipes, and words traveled beside the cargo. This is why the Indian Ocean spice trade should not be imagined as something Europeans later created. By the time Portuguese ships appeared in these waters many centuries afterward, they were entering a commercial world that was already old. Long before a European captain rounded the southern tip of Africa, sailors had been crossing between Arabia and India. Merchants had waited for monsoon winds in foreign ports. African, Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian communities had already built connections across the sea. The great achievement was not a single voyage or discovery. It was generations of accumulated knowledge when to leave, where to stop, whom to trust, what to carry, and when to wait. And the waiting mattered as much as the sailing. A ship could not command the monsoon. A king could not order the wind to reverse. Merchants who wanted the riches of the ocean had to accept its calendar. Trade moved according to a rhythm larger than any empire. As the centuries passed, this rhythm carried greater quantities of spices westward. Pepper moved from India toward the Red Sea. Ships brought eastern goods within reach of Egypt and the Mediterranean. The network that had once consisted of many small exchanges was becoming one of the great commercial systems of the ancient world. And, on the far side of that system, another civilization was developing an appetite that would make pepper famous. Across the Mediterranean, Rome was growing. Soon, Roman cooks would sprinkle an Indian berry into their sauces. Roman writers would complain about the money flowing east to pay for it. Roman merchants would send silver across seas whose winds had been understood long before they arrived. The monsoon had made the journey possible. Now, Rome would make it enormously profitable. In the warm, wet hills behind India's Malabar coast, imagine a sack slowly filling with pepper. The berries have been picked from climbing vines, dried until their skins turned dark and wrinkled, and measured for sale. To the farmer who helped grow them, they are familiar. To the Roman buyer waiting thousands of miles away, they are a luxury from the edge of the known world. Our imaginary sack begins its journey with an Indian merchant. It moves toward a busy western port, where warehouses hold textiles, ivory, gemstones, grain, and spices. Sailors wait for the proper season. Because the first great force carrying this pepper west is not Rome. It is the monsoon, loaded onto a wooden vessel. The sack leaves the Indian coast and enters the Arabian Sea. At night, stars help mark direction. During daylight, the wind holds the sail while the ship moves west across routes already known to generations of Indian, Arab, and other Indian Ocean sailors. Eventually, the cargo reaches the Red Sea world. Roman trade with India expanded greatly during the early imperial period, and Egyptian ports such as Berenice and Myos Hormos became important gateways. Pepper arriving there was still far from Rome. The sea voyage had ended, but another difficult stage was beginning. The sack is unloaded and placed with other cargo bound across Egypt's eastern desert. Camels and pack animals carry goods along roads linking the Red Sea ports with the Nile. Water must be planned carefully. Stations along the route provide places to rest, resupply, and organize the next stage. At the Nile, the character of the journey changes again. Boats can carry cargo downstream through the long green corridor of Egypt. Eventually, the pepper approaches Alexandria, one of the great commercial cities of the Mediterranean. Here, goods from Africa, Arabia, and Asia meet the markets of the Roman world. Another merchant buys the sack. Another ship carries it west, joining the steady movement of cargo toward Italy and the crowded markets of Rome. By the time our pepper reaches Rome, it has crossed an ocean, a desert, a river system, and a sea. It has passed through many hands. No Roman farmer can simply produce more of it outside the city. Every peppercorn carries the cost of distance, and Romans developed a remarkable appetite for it, especially among households wealthy enough to make distant luxuries part of ordinary dining. In wealthy kitchens, cooks ground pepper into sauces for meat, fish, and vegetables. It appeared with wine, herbs, vinegar, and other seasonings. The collection of Roman recipes traditionally associated with the name Apicius uses pepper again and again, sometimes in combinations that may seem surprising to a modern American cook. For diners who could afford it, the flavor also carried status. These ingredients had traveled farther than most people ever would. Putting them on the table was, in a quiet way, putting the reach of the empire on display. Yet there was an irony. Rome could command armies from Britain to Egypt, but it did not command the forests where pepper grew. The empire remained a customer. That bothered some Roman observers. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, complained about the enormous sums Rome sent east for luxury goods from India, Arabia, and China. Pepper particularly puzzled him. It was desired for its pungency, yet Romans were willing to pay dearly for something whose appeal seemed to him difficult to explain. His complaint reveals more than personal taste. Roman elites worried that silver and gold were leaving the empire to purchase luxuries that were consumed and disappeared. A spice was consumed, and then customers wanted more. Archaeology gives the story a physical trail. Roman coins have been found in southern India, especially in regions connected with long-distance commerce. Not every coin represents a direct purchase of pepper, and the trade was more complicated than a simple exchange of Roman silver for Indian spice. Still, the finds remind us that the economic connection was real. Roman demand reached far beyond Roman political borders. Pepper moved west. Wealth moved east. The scale of that appetite turned the Indian berry into one of the most recognizable symbols of long-distance trade. It was valuable because people wanted it, because supply came from far away, and because an extraordinary chain of sailors, merchants, animals, ports, and ships was required to deliver it. Centuries later, pepper still carried enough prestige to appear in one of Rome's darkest moments. When the Visigothic king Alaric surrounded the city in the early 5th century, ancient accounts of the negotiations included a large quantity of pepper among the demanded goods. The detail shows how deeply an imported spice had entered the language of wealth. By then, however, the Roman world was changing. Political authority in the West was weakening. Cities that had once seemed permanent faced uncertainty. It would be tempting to imagine that the spice trade collapsed with Rome. It did not. The roots were older than the empire, and they would outlive it. Merchants still knew the monsoon. Indian ports still produced cargo. Ships still crossed the Arabian Sea, and pepper vines continued growing in the humid hills of the Malabar coast. Indifferent to which emperor ruled in the distant west, Rome had helped create an enormous westward pull for eastern spices. But Rome was only one customer in a much larger story. As imperial power faded in Western Europe, the center of that story shifted. Constantinople remained connected to Eastern commerce. Persian and Arabian merchants continued to move goods. New political powers rose along routes that had already been traveled for centuries. Our imaginary sack of pepper has reached its Roman kitchen. It is opened, ground, scattered into a sauce, and finally disappears into a meal. But another sack is already leaving India, and the ships are still sailing. When the Western Roman Empire weakened and finally lost its last emperor in the late 5th century, there was no moment when the lights simply went out. No merchant standing on a distant dock received word that Rome had fallen and decided the age of trade was over. Ships still needed cargo. Cities still needed food. Wealthy households still wanted luxuries. And far away in India, pepper vines continued to climb through the humid green landscape just as they had before. The political map had changed. The commercial world had not vanished with it. This is an important distinction, because the history of spices can easily become a story told only from the European shore. Rome rise, Rome falls, and then Europe seems to wait in darkness until trade begins again. But from the Indian Ocean, the picture looks very different. The sea remained busy. Merchants continued sailing between India, Arabia, Persia, East Africa, and ports farther east. The monsoon still reversed with the seasons. Sailors still watched the stars and waited for favorable winds. Pepper, aromatics, textile, ivory, precious stones, and countless other goods continued to move through networks that had never depended on Rome for their existence. In the eastern Mediterranean, the Roman Empire itself had not entirely disappeared. Its eastern half survived, centered on Constantinople, the magnificent city overlooking the narrow waters between Europe and Asia. We call this realm the Byzantine Empire today. Although its inhabitants continued to think of themselves as Romans, Constantinople stood in an extraordinary position. Ships approached from the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Roads led through Anatolia and toward lands farther east. Markets gathered goods from different climates and cultures. Silk, spices, wine, grain, metals, and luxury objects passed through a city whose location made it one of the great commercial crossroads of the medieval world. Farther east, Persian powers occupied another vital part of the network. Routes through Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf connected inland cities with maritime trade. Merchants operating through these regions could encounter goods that had begun their journeys in India or beyond. To the south, Arabia remained a bridge between worlds. Its ports faced the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and wider Indian Ocean. A merchant did not need to know every road between India and Constantinople. He needed to know his part of it, which harbour was safe, which market offered a good price, which ruler collected a tax, and which season would bring the wind home. The same was true along the East African coast. Communities there were not passive stops at the edge of someone else's trade. They participated in a maritime world that linked the African interior with Arabia, Persia, India, and eventually regions even farther east. African products moved outward. Foreign goods arrived. Coastal settlements grew around exchange, fishing, farming, and the opportunities created by the sea. Across this enormous region, trade was not controlled by a single empire. That was one reason it survived. A dynasty might collapse in Persia while merchants adjusted their routes. A war might make one harbor dangerous, so ships favored another. A new ruler might impose taxes, while traders negotiated, paid, avoided, or adapted to them. Languages changed along the docks. Religions spread. Coins and systems of payment evolved. The network bent without necessarily breaking. Empires disappear faster than trade networks. A palace can be abandoned in a generation. A dynasty can end in a single defeat. But knowledge about where pepper grows, when the winds change, which mountain pass is open, or where a ship can find fresh water is stored across thousands of people. It lives in families, ports, habits, and memory. And so pepper kept moving west. Perhaps less reached certain European markets during periods of instability. Prices could rise. Routes could shift. But the desire for Eastern spices remained, and the commercial knowledge required to move them remained as well. This long continuity matters because another transformation was approaching. During the 7th century, new armies, cities, states, and trading communities emerged across the Middle East and North Africa with the expansion of Islam. Within generations, territories stretching from the Atlantic approaches to Central Asia were connected by new political and cultural relationships. Older commercial routes did not simply disappear beneath this new world. Many became part of it. Merchants traveled between ports around the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. Cairo would grow into one of the great cities linking Mediterranean consumers with Red Sea commerce. Baghdad would become a center of wealth, learning, craftsmanship, and exchange. Aden would look outward toward the Indian Ocean, and spices would find uses far beyond the kitchen. They would enter pharmacies and perfumes. They would appear in medical writings, elite households, marketplaces, and stories about distant lands. Merchants would know that cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and other aromatics came from the East. But the farther those goods traveled, the more uncertain their exact origins could become. That uncertainty created room for stories. Some would be practical, some would be exaggerated, and some would describe strange creatures guarding precious spices in places almost no Western buyer had ever seen. Rome had faded from the center of the trade. The trade itself was about to enter another golden age. Across the lands that had once formed the eastern provinces of Rome and Persia, a new political and cultural world emerged. From the 7th century onward, Islamic states expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Old roads and sea lanes remained, now serving cities whose markets, workshops, libraries, and ports became some of the busiest on earth. Baghdad, founded beside the Tigris, grew into a great imperial capital. Caravans arrived with goods from Persia and Central Asia, while traffic down the rivers connected the city with Basra and the Persian Gulf. From Basra, merchants looked toward the Indian Ocean, where ships linked Arabia, East Africa, India, and lands farther east. Pepper arrived alongside textiles, pearls, stones, and fragrant woods. Farther south, Aden stood near the entrance to the Red Sea. Its position made it a natural meeting place for ships moving between the Indian Ocean and the markets of Egypt. Cargo arriving from India could be unloaded, taxed, stored, sold, and loaded again. From Red Sea ports, goods travelled toward the Nile and Cairo. Alexandria then opened the way into the Mediterranean. A spice might pass through all these cities without any merchant seeing its entire journey. Sailors knew winds. Caravan leaders knew desert roads. Brokers knew prices. Translators crossed languages. And warehouse owners protected cargo through months of waiting. Spices were useful because they belonged to many worlds at once. In kitchens, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and other aromatics added warmth and fragrance to food. In wealthy households and royal courts, rare ingredients could signal refinement and access to distant trade. In perfumery, aromatic substances were blended with oils, flowers, woods, and resins. Apothecaries stocked ingredients used in remedies for digestion, pain, breathing, and other complaints. Physicians inherited older Greek traditions while also studying, translating, questioning, and expanding them. The same aromatic substance might go to a cook, an apothecary, or a perfumer. Spice value came not simply from taste, but from the many meanings people attached to it. Behind all of this stood knowledge. A successful merchant needed more than a ship and a purse. He needed to know when vessels were expected, which routes were unsafe, where prices were rising, and who controlled a harbor. Sailors studied stars, coastlines, winds, and currents. Geographers gathered reports about lands most readers would never visit, but information weakened with distance. Imagine buying cinnamon in Cairo. You may know that it came through the Red Sea. The merchant who sold it might know the port where it was loaded. Another trader farther east might know more. Yet very few people near the Mediterranean had stood in the forests where the bark itself was harvested. Into those empty spaces came stories. One of the most famous concerned cinnamon birds. Ancient writers had already repeated tales of great birds gathering cinnamon in remote places and carrying it to nests built high on cliffs. People supposedly had to trick the birds in order to obtain the precious spice. Other stories placed valuable aromatics in landscapes guarded by dangerous creatures or surrounded by extraordinary hazards. To modern ears, such tales sound fantastic, but their world had no photographs, satellite maps, instant message, or easy way to verify a product's origin thousands of miles away. Most people knew distant places through other people. A sailor told a merchant told a customer. A traveler repeated something heard in a foreign port. A writer copied an older account. With every retelling, geography could become mixed with rumor, exaggeration, memory, and wonder. And sometimes mystery was useful. If buyers did not know exactly where a valuable product came from, they could not easily bypass the merchants who supplied it. Information itself had commercial value. Knowing a route, a source, a season, or a trustworthy contact could be as important as owning the cargo. For centuries, cities across the Islamic world held central positions in this exchange, linking the spice-producing regions of Asia with Mediterranean markets. Pepper and cinnamon continued west. Ginger, cloves, perfumes, medicines, textile, and stories moved with them. Eventually, they reached European merchants waiting on the other side of the Mediterranean. And among all the European cities competing for Eastern luxuries, one was especially well placed to turn distance into profit. It rose from a lagoon at the northern edge of the Adriatic, built on islands, canals, timber piles, and commerce. Its merchants would learn the markets of Alexandria and the eastern Mediterranean with extraordinary care. Its warehouses would fill with goods from worlds far beyond the horizon. and its wealth would become so closely tied to Eastern trade that other European powers would eventually search for a way around it. That city was Venice. Step into a wealthy European household in the later Middle Ages, and the kitchen is already awake long before the banquet begins. A fire burns beneath iron pots. A cook leans over a heavy mortar, grinding peppercorns with a pestle until the hard black berries become a fragrant powder. Nearby are ingredients that have traveled farther than anyone in the house ever will. Ginger has come from Asia. Cinnamon has crossed seas and passed through many merchants. Cloves have begun their journey on distant tropical islands. Saffron is costly for a different reason. An extraordinary amount of careful labor is required to gather even a small quantity. To a wealthy medieval cook, these are not curiosities kept behind glass. They are ingredients. Pepper might sharpen a sauce served with meat or fish. Ginger could bring warmth to a dish. Cinnamon might appear beside sugar and wine. Cloves could add a powerful fragrance in very small amounts. Saffron could give food a rich golden color. Medieval European cooking often favored combinations that may surprise a modern diner. Sweet and savory flavors could appear together. Sauces might combine wine or vinegar with spices. Bread, es fruit, or sugar. The goal was not simply to make food hot or heavily seasoned. Skilled cooks balanced aromas, colors, textures, and tastes. This brings us to one of the most persistent myths about the history of spices, the idea that medieval Europeans covered rotten meat with pepper and cinnamon to hide the taste. It makes a memorable story, but it makes little economic sense. Imported spices were expensive. The households able to use them generously were usually the same households with the resources to obtain good meat, employ cooks, preserve food, and manage supplies. Spoiled meat could also make people ill. Spices were prized because people enjoyed them and because serving them said something about the person who could afford them. At a bonk, that message was difficult to miss. Imagine dishes arriving in sequence. The room smells of roasted meat, baked pastry, wine, smoke, and spice. A sauce carries pepper and ginger. Another dish glows yellow with saffron. Wine may be warmed or flavored with cinnamon, cloves, or other aromatics. For a guest, flavor is only part of the experience. Every imported spice on the table represents distance. A peppercorn has traveled from India. A clove may have begun on an island so remote that no one in the room could describe it accurately. The host has paid not only for an ingredient, but for the chain of merchants, sailors, ports, warehouses, tolls, and risks that brought it there. To serve rare spices was therefore to display access to the wider world. In a world where most people ate what their own region could provide, the taste of something carried across continents could feel remarkable. But leave the banquet hall and walk into another room, and the same ingredients take on a different identity. Here is the apothecary's world. Shelves hold jars, dried plants, resins, powders, oils, and preparations measured carefully for customers. Medieval medicine inherited ideas from Greek and Roman writers and encountered medical traditions preserved and developed in the Islamic world. Within these systems, spices were often treated as substances that could influence the body's balance. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatics appeared in medicinal preparations. They might be recommended for digestion, warming the body, strengthening a patient, or correcting an imbalance according to the medical theories of the period. The distinction between medicine and food was not always sharp. A spiced drink could be pleasant and medicinal at once. A fragrant ingredient might move from kitchen to pharmacy and then into perfume or religious use. This gave spices an unusual power in medieval life. They were desirable in several different worlds at the same time. They offered flavor. They suggested health. They carried fragrance. And, perhaps most visibly, yet every European cook who reached for pepper depended on commercial networks extending far beyond Europe. Those networks converged in Mediterranean ports, and no European city became more closely associated with the profitable movement of Eastern luxuries than Venice. Beyond the kitchen door. The next part of our story is already arriving by ship. At dusk, Venice seems to float between sea and sky. The lagoon turns silver. Church domes darken against the horizon, and long wooden vessels move slowly toward the city. One of them is a merchant galley returning from the eastern Mediterranean, carrying goods that crossed far greater distances than its sailors. As the ship reaches its berth, dock workers begin unloading. Bales of cloth, sacks, boxes, and barrels pass from deck to quay. Somewhere among them are pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatics. Some began their journeys in India or lands farther east. They crossed the Indian Ocean, entered markets in Egypt or the Levant, and changed hands before Venetian merchants ever saw them. Now they enter another world of commerce. The cargo is weighed and duties assessed. Clerks bend over ledgers, recording purchases, debts, and payments. Merchants compare prices, while warehouses protect valuable goods from rain, theft, and the damp air of the lagoon. Venice did not produce the spices that made its merchants wealthy. Its advantage came from position, experience, ships, capital, and relationships. By the later Middle Ages, Venetian merchants had developed strong commercial connections with the eastern Mediterranean. Their galleys sailed regularly toward ports such as Alexandria and trading centers in the Levant. There they entered markets connected, through many intermediaries, with the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Alexandria was especially important. Goods arriving from the east could reach Egypt through Red Sea routes, then move toward the Nile and Mediterranean coast. Under the Mamluk sultans, Egypt occupied a place between Asian commerce and European demand. Merchants, brokers, officials, sailors, and caravan operators all helped move goods through this system. A Venetian merchant arriving in Alexandria was therefore not stepping into a market Venice controlled. He was entering someone else's commercial world. He needed local contacts, paid taxes and fees, and depended on systems operating long before his galley appeared offshore. Treaties could open opportunities, conflict could interrupt them. Yet Venice became skilled at working within this complicated environment. Its merchants shared risk, while its government negotiated commercial privileges abroad. Organized galley routes linked Venice with major Mediterranean markets. Information about prices, shortages, and expected ships moved beside the cargo. Back in Venice, much of this commercial life gathered around the Rialto. The district was a working center of finance and trade. Marchand mit. Contracts were arranged, coins changed hands, and news traveled quickly. A delayed shipment in Alexandria could matter in Venice. A poor pepper supply in India might eventually affect prices far across Europe. The city became one of Europe's great distribution points for Eastern luxuries. But it is important not to imagine that Venice simply controlled all spice entering Europe. Spices reached Europe through several competing routes involving Genoese, Catalan, Islamic Mediterranean, and other merchants. Venice's position was not absolute. It was advantageous. Its Adriatic location gave access to European markets, while maritime experience connected it to the Eastern Mediterranean. Once spices reached Venetian warehouses, they could be resold north and west. Pepper might leave Venice and cross the Alps, Cinnamon could travel toward German cities. Other spices passed through fairs until small quantities reached noble households and apothecaries. With each mile, another merchant took a share. Venice did not need to grow pepper. It needed access to the places where Eastern goods entered Mediterranean commerce, and ships to distribute them onward. For merchants elsewhere in Europe, however, the same system could look frustrating. Every intermediary meant another payment. Every toll increased the price. Every political border created another uncertainty. A sack of pepper that was valuable in India could become extraordinarily expensive by the time it reached northern or western Europe. And so, a tempting question began to grow. What if the intermediaries could be bypassed? What if European ships could somehow reach the source of the spices themselves? At first, this sounded almost unreasonable. The known Mediterranean routes led east, through commercial worlds dominated by powers that Portugal could not simply ignore. Sailing around Africa meant following an enormous coastline into waters Europeans understood poorly. But Portugal faced the Atlantic. Its geography placed it far from the profitable eastern Mediterranean trade. Yet that same geography offered another possibility. Portuguese sailors were already moving down the western coast of Africa, voyage by voyage, learning currents, winds, icelands, and shorelines. Venice had prospered by mastering the Mediterranean connection to the east. Portugal would gamble on finding another way. For generations, the richest spice traffic reaching Europe had come from the east, through the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Portugal stood far from those routes, facing instead the broad Atlantic. To a merchant in Lisbon, that could seem like a disadvantage. But during the 15th century, the ocean beyond Portugal's shore slowly became something else, a possible road around the old commercial world. The story did not begin suddenly in 1453. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, Portuguese expansion into the Atlantic had already been underway for decades. The motives were mixed. There was profit, gold, trade, Christian ambition, and strategic competition. Access to the wealth of Asia became part of a much larger project that had begun long before anyone knew whether a sea route to India was possible. Portugal was a small kingdom, but its ports opened directly onto the Atlantic, where its sailors became increasingly familiar with distant waters. Early expeditions moved into the Atlantic islands. Madeira became a Portuguese possession and a place of settlement and plantation agriculture. The Azores, farther out in the ocean, offered another set of islands from which Portuguese experience expanded. These were not yet voyages to India, but they taught practical lessons about ships, winds, currents, navigation, and distant trade. Then attention moved steadily down the coast of Africa. Prince Henry, later remembered as Henry the Navigator, became closely associated with this era of exploration. He was not personally sailing into unknown seas, and the familiar image of a single prince directing every discovery from a school of navigation is too simple. His importance lay more in patronage, organization, and support for expeditions during the earlier stages of Portuguese expansion. Voyage after voyage pushed farther south. Progress could be slow. Sailors had to learn the currents, the winds that made a return voyage difficult, where fresh water could be found, and where local communities were willing to trade. The African coast was not empty. Portuguese sailors encountered societies with their own rulers, economies, languages, and trading systems. Gold from West Africa became especially important to Portuguese ambitions. So did ivory and other goods. Tragically, the expanding Atlantic system also became increasingly tied to the trafficking and enslavement of African people, creating patterns of exploitation that would grow enormously in the centuries ahead. Yet the farther Portuguese vessels travelled, the more one geographical question came to dominate their ambitions. Did Africa have an end that a ship could sail around? If it did, then the ocean beyond might connect with the waters leading toward India. If it did not, the dream of reaching the spice trade by sea would remain exactly that. The coastline continued south. Navigators improved their understanding of Atlantic winds. Instead of always hugging the shore, sailors learned that a faster route could require sailing far into the ocean before turning back toward land. Exploration became a body of accumulated practical knowledge. Then, in the late 15th century, Bartolomeu Dias sailed farther than any previous Portuguese expedition along the African coast. His ships encountered severe weather in the southern Atlantic. Driven away from the coastline, Dias sailed through rough seas without immediately realizing what had happened. When his expedition finally turned east and then north, land appeared in a surprising direction. They had passed the southern end of Africa. In 1488, Dias had demonstrated something that generations of Portuguese planners had hoped might be true. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected by a navigable sea route around Africa. The Cape was dangerous, with violent winds, heavy seas, and enormous distances. Dias called it the Cape of Storms, according to later tradition. King John II preferred a more hopeful name, the Cape of Good Hope. Beyond that cape lay the Indian Ocean, and somewhere across that ocean were the ports that supplied pepper, cinnamon, and other goods Europe had been purchasing through long chains of intermediaries. But proving that a ship could round Africa was not the same as reaching India. The route ahead stretched for thousands of miles along the eastern coast of Africa and then across waters governed by the monsoon. Portuguese sailors would have to enter ports where established African, Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants already knew the commercial world far better than they did. Dias had opened the door, but he had not walked through it. Nearly a decade would pass before another expedition left Lisbon with a more ambitious purpose to round the Cape, continue north, cross the Indian Ocean, and reach the spice markets themselves. The route was possible. Now Portugal needed someone to sail all of it. In 1497, a small fleet left Lisbon and turned toward the Atlantic. At its head was Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese nobleman entrusted with a task that had occupied his kingdom for generations: sail around Africa, enter the Indian Ocean, and reach India by sea. Lisbon slowly disappeared behind them. Rather than simply follow the African shore, the fleet made a wide sweep to the Atlantic, using winds Portuguese navigators had learned through decades of exploration. Ahead waited the cape that Bartolomeu Dias had rounded less than a decade earlier. The seas there could be violent, but the fleet passed the cape and entered waters leading north along Africa's eastern coast. This was a new world to the Portuguese, but it was not an isolated one. Along the East African coast stood trading towns connected to the Indian Ocean economy. Merchants there dealt in gold, ivory, textile, ceramics, and goods from Arabia, Persia, and India. Muslim communities had lived and traded along these shores for centuries. Ships crossed between ports according to the monsoon seasons. The Portuguese had finally reached the commercial system they had spent so long trying to find. They were newcomers. At ports such as Mozambique and Mombasa, relations were uncertain and sometimes hostile. Farther north, at Malindi, da Gama obtained the navigational help needed for the next great crossing. With favorable winds, the fleet left Africa and sailed northeast across the Indian Ocean. Then, in 1498, land appeared. The Portuguese had reached the Malabar coast of India. For later European histories, this moment would often be described as the discovery of the sea route to India. From Lisbon, That description made sense. Portugal had finally connected the Atlantic directly to the Indian Ocean by sailing around Africa. But from Calicut, nothing had been discovered. The city was already a sophisticated commercial center. Its harbor and markets belonged to an old trading world linking India with Arabia, Persia, East Africa, and regions farther east. Indian merchants dealt beside Muslim merchants whose networks stretched across the ocean. Textile, pepper, precious stones, aromatics, and many other goods passed through the city. Da Gama had not arrived at the end of the world. He had arrived at the middle of someone else's. Calicut was ruled by the Zamorin, whose prosperity depended in part on maintaining a busy and open commercial environment. Foreign merchants were familiar visitors, and warehouses held goods while traders waited for buyers or favorable winds. The Portuguese therefore faced an awkward problem. They had crossed extraordinary distances, expecting their arrival to be extraordinary. But the merchants of Calicut judged them by a much simpler question. What had they brought to trade? The answer was disappointing. The gifts presented by the Portuguese included items that may have seemed respectable in Lisbon, but looked modest beside the luxury commerce of the Indian Ocean. Cloth, huts, sugar, oil, and other goods did little to impress people accustomed to merchants carrying valuable silver, fine textile, and desirable products from across Asia. The imbalance showed how little Portugal understood the market it hoped to enter. Still, Da Gama had achieved the central purpose of the expedition. A Portuguese fleet had sailed from Europe around Africa to India and could, at least in principle, sail home again. The return was punishing. Disease, exhaustion, and the long months at sea took a severe toll. Many men did not survive. But when the remaining ships reached Portugal, they carried something more important than the modest quantity of spices aboard. They carried proof. The sea route worked, and if one expedition could reach India, another could return with more ships, more silver, better trade goods, and greater ambitions. The profit was difficult to ignore. Pepper purchased closer to its source could be sold in Europe at prices shaped by enormous demand. Portugal now possessed a route that might allow its merchants to bypass much of the Mediterranean chain that had enriched intermediaries for centuries. Yet commerce was only one possible way to use that route. Portugal soon began sending larger expeditions into the Indian Ocean. The tone changed. The newcomers were no longer content simply to appear in established markets and compete under existing rules. They wanted favorable terms, strategic ports, and eventually control over important parts of maritime trade. When Vasco da Gama returned to India on a later voyage, he came not merely as an explorer seeking a market, but with a heavily armed fleet. Violence followed. Portuguese forces attacked shipping and used naval power to intimidate rivals and pressure coastal rulers. One notorious episode involved the destruction of a vessel carrying Muslim passengers, an act remembered as one of the darkest events associated with Da Gama's career. The first voyage had asked whether Portugal could reach the spice trade. The voyages that followed asked whether Portugal could dominate it. This was a shift. For centuries, the Indian Ocean had supported overlapping networks of merchants who competed, negotiated, paid duties, formed partnerships, and adapted to local rulers. Conflict certainly existed before the Portuguese arrived, but Portugal brought a systematic attempt to combine commerce with heavily armed ships and control of strategic sea lanes. Pepper remained the same small dried berry. What changed was the scale of the struggle surrounding it. From the Malabar coast, Portuguese ambitions would spread toward Goa, the Persian Gulf, and Southeast Asia. Fortresses would appear beside old trading ports. Ships would be stopped and inspected. Passes would be demanded. Cannon would become another tool of commerce. The long search for a route around Africa was over. Now began the struggle over who would control the route itself. By the early 16th century, Portugal had done something extraordinary. Its ships had rounded Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and reached the markets of India. But reaching the spice trade was no longer enough. Portuguese commanders increasingly wanted to shape the rules of the sea itself. Their strategy was built around a chain of fortified ports rather than the conquest of every inland kingdom. In 1510, Portuguese forces seized Goa on India's western coast. Goa became the administrative center of the Estado da India. From there, officials could supply fleets, repair ships, store cargo, and watch traffic moving through the Arabian Sea. To the northwest stood Hormuz, near the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Whoever held influence there could interfere with one of the great channels connecting the Indian Ocean to Persia and the Middle East. Portuguese forces established control over Hormuz in the early 16th century, adding another strategic point to their maritime system. Then, attention turned farther east. Across the Bay of Bengal and beyond the Malay Peninsula lay Malacca, one of the great crossroads of Asian commerce. Ships from India, China, Southeast Asia, and the Indonesian islands met there. Pepper, textile, porcelain, metals, and spices moved through its markets. In 1511, the Portuguese captured the city. Look at those places on a map, and the logic becomes clear. Goa, Hormuz, Malacca. Portugal did not need to occupy all the land between them. It wanted positions near the narrow passages and commercial centers through which ships and goods had to move. The objective was no longer simply to buy pepper. It was to control movement. One of the clearest expressions of this ambition was the cartaz system. Portuguese authorities required many merchant vessels operating in waters they claimed to control to carry a naval pass. A ship without the proper document could be stopped, searched, fined, have its cargo seized, or face worse consequences. The system was never enforced everywhere with equal success, but its purpose was unmistakable. Portugal was trying to turn naval power into commercial power. Cannon made that attempt possible. Portuguese ships were not invincible, and Asian states had powerful forces of their own. Still, heavily armed vessels could threaten merchant shipping, blockade ports, and attack from the sea. Fortresses gave them places to resupply. This marked an important change in the long history of the spice trade. For centuries, merchants had crossed the Indian Ocean through overlapping systems of negotiation. Taxation, partnership, rivalry, and local authority. Wars and piracy existed, and rulers had long profited from commerce. But the Portuguese attempted something more systematic, a maritime empire built around armed ships, fortified ports, compulsory passes, and control over strategic routes. They wanted pepper and cinnamon to flow through channels they could tax. They wanted Muslim merchants and other competitors weakened. They wanted spices carried toward Lisbon rather than only through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf toward older Mediterranean networks. For a time, it changed global commerce. Portuguese ships carried pepper around the Cape of Good Hope. Lisbon became an important spice market. Cargoes, once routed mainly through eastern Mediterranean intermediaries, could now reach Europe by the Atlantic. Yet the empire contained a weakness that was visible almost from the beginning. It was enormous. The distance from Lisbon to Goa was immense. Malacca lay farther still. Hormuz, East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia all required ships, soldiers, administrators, money, repairs, supplies, and reliable communication. A message sent from Asia might take months to reach Portugal. Orders from the king could arrive after the situation that inspired them had already changed. And Portugal itself was small. There were never enough Portuguese people to fill such a vast maritime world. The empire depended heavily on local allies, Asian sailors, merchants, interpreters, soldiers, and administrators. Portuguese power could look impressive at a fortress while remaining thin beyond it. Corruption created another problem. Officials stationed thousands of miles from Lisbon often pursued private trade alongside royal business. Smuggling weakened monopolies. Captains and merchants had incentives to bend rules when fortunes could be made from a single cargo. The Indian Ocean was simply too large to be completely controlled by one distant kingdom. Merchants adapted. Routes shifted. Local rulers resisted. The Red Sea trade continued. Asian ships continued sailing. Portugal had forced itself into the network, but it had not replaced the network, and success created another danger. Other Europeans could see what Portuguese ships were bringing home: pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and stories of extraordinary profits reached northern markets. Maps improved, knowledge spread, and the route around Africa was no longer Portugal's secret. Far to the north, merchants in the Netherlands were building ships, raising capital, and watching the spice trade with growing interest. They did not merely want to purchase what Portugal brought back. They wanted to sail east themselves. Portugal had spent generations finding a road to the spices. Soon, a new rival would arrive with enough ships, money, and ambition to challenge Portugal on that very road. In 1492, while Portugal was still working its way around Africa, Christopher Columbus sailed west with a different idea. He was not trying to discover a new continent. He believed the Atlantic could provide another route to Asia, to the wealthy trading worlds Europeans associated with silk, precious goods, and spices. When land appeared, Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia. Instead, his ships had entered the Caribbean and a world unknown to Europeans. He searched for signs of Asian wealth and asked about valuable products. Spices were part of the economic imagination behind the voyage, but the familiar Asian spices were not waiting there. There were no Malabar pepper plantations and no clove groves from the Moluccas. What Columbus had done was more consequential than the route he intended to find. His voyages opened sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, beginning exchanges of plants, animals, diseases, people, and commodities that would transform societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet the old goal remained. European rulers still wanted direct access to Asia, and especially to the islands where cloves and nutmeg grew. A generation later, another expedition set out to solve the problem from the west. Ferdinand Magellan was Portuguese by birth, but sailed in the service of Spain. By then, Portugal had established an eastern route around Africa, while Spain sought a western route that might bring the Spice Islands within its own sphere of influence. In 1519, Magellan left Spain with 5 ships and a crew drawn from several European countries. They crossed the Atlantic and moved down the coast of South America, searching for a passage through the continent. At last they entered the narrow, twisting waterway now called the Strait of Magellan. Beyond it lay an ocean so vast that the expedition could scarcely have understood its scale. Magellan called it peaceful after the rough waters they had endured, giving us the name Pacific. But crossing it was anything but easy. The ships sailed for months as hunger and disease weakened the crews. Eventually they reached the Philippines. There, Magellan became involved in local political conflicts. In 1521, he was killed during fighting on the island of Mactan, but the voyage continued. The surviving sailors finally reached the Moluccas. the islands Europeans had been seeking for so long. Here, cloves were not mysterious objects arriving through distant intermediaries. The trees themselves grew in the tropical landscape. The crews had reached one of the sources of the spice trade. They loaded cloves aboard their remaining ships. Now came another decision. Returning east across the Pacific was dangerous and uncertain. One vessel attempted a Pacific return and failed. The Victoria, commanded by Juan Sebastian Elcano, sailed west instead. That choice transformed the expedition. The Victoria crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and struggled north through the Atlantic toward Spain. The sailors were exhausted. Food was scarce, and many who had departed years earlier were dead. In 1522, the Victoria finally entered the Spanish port of San Lucar de Barrameda. Only one of the original 5 ships had completed the journey. Only a small fraction of the original expedition returned aboard her. Yet in the hold was a cargo of cloves. The commercial value of those spices helped demonstrate why European kingdoms had risked so much to reach their source. But the voyage had achieved something even larger. A ship had sailed around the world, across the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, and Atlantic again. For thousands of years, spices had moved in stages. A merchant carried them to a port. A sailor took them across one sea. A caravan moved them over land. Another merchant carried them onward. Now a single expedition had physically traced a route around the planet and reached the islands that produced cloves. The achievement did not make global travel easy. It did not settle the rivalry between Spain and Portugal. And it certainly did not place the Spice Islands permanently under Spanish control. The Pacific was too enormous, the routes too dangerous, and Asian commerce too complex for that. But something fundamental had changed. Europeans now understood, through experience rather than imagination, that the great spice-producing regions of Asia could be approached from both directions around the globe. The ancient networks of the Indian Ocean had become connected to Atlantic empires and American shores. The search for spices had helped reveal the true scale of the oceans separating them. And on the far side of those oceans stood a few tiny islands whose trees produced cloves and nutmeg in quantities the rest of the world could not easily reproduce. The spice routes had now wrapped around the planet. The next struggle would be over those islands themselves. Before Dutch power transformed the Banda Islands, they were already part of a much older trading world. Far out in the Banda Sea, the islands rise from deep tropical water. They are small, green, and volcanic, with steep slopes descending toward narrow strips of coast. Rain falls generously on dark, fertile soil. Villages and landing places sit close to waters that had carried traders for generations. Here grew the nutmeg tree. To people living in the Banda Islands, nutmeg was not an exotic treasure from the edge of the earth. It was part of the landscape. Families tended the trees and knew when the fruit ripened, how to gather it, and how to prepare it for trade. The fruit itself hides its value beautifully. At first glance, a ripe nutmeg fruit can resemble a small apricot or peach. As it matures, the pale yellow flesh splits open. Inside is a glossy dark seed wrapped in a bright red covering that looks almost like a delicate net. That red covering is mace. The seed inside is nutmeg. 2 spices emerge from one fruit. The mace is carefully removed and dried. The seed is dried as well, becoming the hard nutmeg familiar today. For centuries, this harvest entered Asian trading networks long before Europeans reached the islands. Bandanese communities did not live in isolation, waiting to be discovered. Their islands stood within maritime routes linking eastern Indonesia to larger commercial centers. Traders from Java, the Malay world, and other parts of Asia came seeking nutmeg and mace. In return came rice, textile, ceramics, metals, and necessities the small islands could not easily produce themselves. And there was one fact that made Banda extraordinary. Nutmeg had an exceptionally narrow natural home. Before the tree was successfully transplanted elsewhere, these islands were the world's principal source of nutmeg and mace. Buyers in India, the Middle East, or Europe could not simply find another source closer to home. Geography had created a natural monopoly. For centuries, distance had protected the mystery of nutmeg. Now better ships and expanding European finance were bringing distant buyers directly to the orchard. What had once been a remote source at the end of a long chain was becoming a place foreign companies intended to possess. Yet this did not mean one ruler controlled every tree. Bandanese producers sold to different traders, and Asian merchants competed within networks built over generations. But Europeans began looking at the same geography in a different way. To a merchant in Amsterdam, the distance between Banda and Europe represented profit. Nutmeg was light, durable, and valuable. And if every nutmeg tree grew within a tiny group of islands, another thought followed naturally. What if one company controlled the islands? Then it might control the supply. And if it controlled the supply, it could influence the price paid by customers thousands of miles away. But far away, European competition was becoming more organized and more aggressive. Portuguese merchants had reached the region, yet never completely controlled Banda's nutmeg trade. Asian traders remained active. Nutmeg's rarity had once made Banda prosperous by bringing merchants to its shores. Now the same rarity made the islands a target. A natural accident of botany was becoming a political problem. The question was no longer simply who could buy the harvest, but whether anyone could claim the right to buy all of it. Then ships began arriving from the Netherlands. The newcomers wanted to break Portuguese power and reach the spices directly. At first, they needed what every foreign merchant needed: access to local producers. But access would not satisfy them for long. The small size of the Banda Islands made something imaginable here that would have been nearly impossible with a crop grown across an entire continent. Control the ports. Control the contracts. Control the harvest. Prevent competitors from buying the spice. In theory, control Banda, and you could control nutmeg. The idea was simple enough to fit into a merchant's ledger. Making it real would be another matter. For the people who lived among the nutmeg trees, the approaching struggle would transform their islands. For the Dutch, Banda would become a test of how far a trading company might go to protect a monopoly. The sea remained calm. The orchards were still green. Nutmeg fruits continued opening beneath the tropical sun. But ships were coming. In 1602, the Dutch Republic brought several competing trading ventures together into a single organization, the Dutch East India Company, better known by its initials, the VOC. Its purpose was commerce, but it was given powers that made it unlike an ordinary merchant partnership. It could send fleets across oceans, negotiate treaties, build forts, administer settlements, and wage war in the name of protecting Dutch trade. In Amsterdam, investors supplied capital and received shares in the company. Their money financed ships, sailors, warehouses, weapons, and voyages that could last for years. The structure helped spread the enormous risks of long-distance commerce. A ship might sink, a cargo might spoil, or a war might close a port. But a successful fleet returning with pepper, cloves, nutmeg, or other Asian goods could produce extraordinary returns. The VOC therefore looked east with a very specific ambition. It did not simply want a place in the spice trade. It wanted to remove rivals and secure privileged access to the places where the most valuable spices grew. To manage this expanding system, the Dutch established Batavia on Java as their principal Asian headquarters. From there, officials tried to coordinate ships, contracts, soldiers, warehouses, and correspondence across a maritime world stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. The company became a bureaucracy at sea, keeping records and issuing orders while also possessing its own armed power. Nowhere were those ambitions more severe than in the Banda Islands. The Bandanese had long traded nutmeg with Asian merchants and were accustomed to selling within a competitive commercial world. The VOC wanted something different, exclusive contracts that would prevent producers from selling nutmeg to anyone else, especially English and other Asian traders. Local resistance followed. Agreements were disputed or ignored. Dutch officials answered with increasing pressure. At the center of this policy stood Jan Pieterszoon Koen, Governor-General of the VOC and a determined advocate of monopoly. In 1621, Koen led a major campaign against Banda. The result was catastrophic for the Bandanese population. People were killed, displaced, deported, or enslaved. Communities that had tended the nutmeg landscape for generations were shattered. The details are grim, but the larger historical point can be stated quietly enough. Commercial monopoly was imposed through organized violence. Afterward, the VOC reorganized nutmeg production. Land was divided into plantation-like estates, often known as perken. European leaseholders managed production under company rules. While much of the labor was performed by enslaved people brought from elsewhere in the region, the nutmeg tree still flowered. The fruit still opened in the same tropical heat. But the social world around it had been transformed. The company now attempted to determine who could grow nutmeg, who could buy it, where it could be shipped, and how much would reach the market. The goal was not maximum production. Too much spice could lower prices. Scarcity itself had to be managed. The same logic shaped Dutch efforts in the clove-producing islands farther north. Clove cultivation was concentrated in areas the VOC could supervise, while trees outside approved zones could be cut down or destroyed. Company expeditions enforced restrictions and tried to prevent unauthorized production and smuggling. This was something more ambitious than owning ships. The VOC was trying to control nature. A tree growing in the wrong place threatened the price of cloves in Amsterdam. A nutmeg seed carried away from Banda threatened the value of an entire monopoly. Forests and orchards became part of corporate strategy, yet complete control was never easy. Smuggling continued. Local resistance continued. Asian merchants adapted, and the English remained a persistent rival, especially on a tiny island called Run. Run belonged to the Banda Group and was small enough to seem almost insignificant on a map. But nutmeg trees grew there, which made the island valuable far beyond its size. English traders established claims and alliances on Run, while the Dutch sought to remove them. The struggle became part of the wider Anglo-Dutch competition for trade. Eventually, that rivalry reached far beyond the Spice Islands. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda helped end the Second Anglo-Dutch War and settled several colonial disputes. The Dutch position on Run was recognized, while the English retained New Netherland in North America, including New Amsterdam, which had been seized and renamed New York. This is sometimes reduced to a wonderfully neat story: the Dutch traded Manhattan for a nutmeg island. The reality was more complicated. The treaty settled a broad collection of wartime conquests and claims across different parts of the world. No one simply sat at a table and exchanged Manhattan directly for Run, as though swapping two pieces on a board. Still, the comparison reveals something important about the age. To European states in the 17th century, a tiny tropical island producing a rare spice could possess strategic value that seems astonishing today. New Amsterdam's future as one of the world's great cities was not yet visible. Nutmeg's profitability was, for a time, Dutch control of the spice trade brought enormous wealth and influence. VOC ships connected Asian ports with warehouses in the Netherlands. Amsterdam merchants sold spices into European markets, while company officials in Asia watched harvests, prices, competitors, and shipping schedules. But the system carried a weakness within itself. A monopoly based on geography survives only while the geography remains exclusive. Nutmeg trees do not understand company charters. Clove trees do not recognize borders. Seeds can be hidden. Seedlings can be carried aboard ships. Knowledge can travel with gardeners and farmers. For perhaps the clearest moment in spice history, a corporation attempted to control not merely trade, but nature itself. And for a while, it came remarkably close. Yet every year, the price of nutmeg remained high. The reward for breaking the monopoly grew larger. Rival powers began searching for living plants rather than sacks of dried spice. The next great challenge to Dutch control would not come only from cannon or warships. It would come from seeds. After the Dutch East India Company had spent decades guarding islands, restricting harvests, and trying to keep valuable spice trees within carefully controlled boundaries, its rivals began to understand a simple truth. They did not necessarily need to conquer the Dutch spice empire. They only needed to make its geography less important. A sack of cloves could be seized. A ship could be stopped. A trading post could be defended by cannon. But a living seed was different, hidden in a pocket, packed among supplies, or carried as a young plant aboard a ship. It contained the possibility of an entirely new source of supply, and so the struggle for spices slowly entered a quieter phase, botanical espionage. European empires became increasingly interested in moving useful plants. Botanical gardens could serve as laboratories of empire, testing whether valuable crops from one tropical region might survive in another. The work was difficult. Seeds had to survive long voyages, while young trees needed water, shade, suitable soil, and protection from salt air. Still, the potential reward was enormous. Among the figures associated with this effort was the French administrator and plant collector Pierre Poivre. During the 18th century, Poivre worked to obtain valuable spice plants from regions where the Dutch sought to restrict them and establish those plants in French possessions in the Indian Ocean. Seeds and seedlings were carried toward islands such as Mauritius and Réunion. Some attempts failed. Others survived. Gardens became nurseries from which plants could spread again. In each new garden, success might begin with only a few surviving plants. Yet those plants could flower, fruit, and provide the next generation of seeds. A secret carried across one ocean could slowly become an ordinary crop. This did not destroy Dutch power overnight. The change was gradual. A clove tree, growing beyond Dutch control, represented something more dangerous than one stolen cargo. It could produce more cloves, and more trees. Once a valuable plant became established somewhere new, geography could no longer protect the old monopoly in quite the same way. Cloves began to spread through other parts of the Indian Ocean world. During the 19th century, Zanzibar, off the coast of East Africa, became one of the great centers of clove cultivation. Plantations expanded, often through enslaved labor, reminding us that breaking one monopoly did not end exploitation. Nutmeg traveled too. The tree that had once made the Banda Islands uniquely important was gradually introduced into other tropical colonies. In the Caribbean, nutmeg eventually took root in Grenada, where warm temperatures and abundant rainfall offered conditions in which the trees could flourish. The irony was remarkable. For generations, European companies had fought over a few Indonesian islands because nutmeg grew naturally there. Once the tree was successfully carried across the world, the foundation of that struggle began to disappear. Pepper followed a broader pattern, spreading into additional tropical regions as global agriculture moved plants and knowledge. The map of spices was being redrawn. A plant's birthplace no longer determined where future generations of that plant would grow. Cloves from the Moluccas could flourish near East Africa. Nutmeg from Banda could become a Caribbean crop. Seeds could cross oceans more easily than companies could defend every shoreline. This was the weakness hidden inside every botanical monopoly. The more valuable the monopoly became, the more valuable it became to break it. And once enough plants escaped, scarcity began to weaken. Prices could still rise and fall. Empires could still tax production. Plantation owners could still accumulate fortunes. But no company could easily restore the old world in which one tiny island group held nearly all the trees. For centuries, the spice trade had been shaped by the fact that certain flavors came from very specific places. Now those places were multiplying, and at almost the same time, another plant was completing an even more astonishing journey. It had not come from India, Indonesia, or the ancient spice lands of Asia at all. It came from the Americas. Within only a few centuries, it would become so deeply rooted in the cuisines of India, China, Korea, Thailand, and much of Southeast Asia that it would seem as though it had always been there. That plant was the chili pepper. For thousands of years, the great spice story seemed to point east. Pepper came from India. Cloves and nutmeg came from islands in Southeast Asia. Cinnamon came from the lands around the Indian Ocean. European sailors crossed dangerous seas because they wanted direct access to those flavors. Yet one of the most dramatic changes in the history of spice would move in exactly the opposite direction. Before the voyages of Columbus, there were no chili peppers in India. There were none in Thailand, none in Sichuan, and none in Korea. The cuisines we now associate with bright red chilies and fierce heat had developed for centuries without them. Chili peppers belong to the genus Capsicum, and their story begins in the Americas. Indigenous peoples had cultivated different varieties for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Across the Americas, chilies were already food, seasoning, and part of local agricultural knowledge. Some were mild. Others produced the burning sensation that would eventually transform kitchens on the other side of the planet. After 1492, plants began crossing oceans on a scale never seen before. Historians call this vast movement the Columbian Exchange. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, tobacco, and chilies traveled outward from the Americas, while wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, and many other organisms moved in the other direction. Diseases crossed as well, with catastrophic consequences for indigenous populations. Among all these travelers, the chili pepper was unusually well suited to spreading. It could grow in many warm climates. Its seeds were easy to carry. Plants produced fruit quickly, without requiring a tiny island or guarded forest. Unlike nutmeg or cloves, chili could escape the geography that had made older spices so expensive. European ships carried capsicum across the Atlantic from Iberian ports. It entered Mediterranean and African worlds. Portuguese maritime networks then helped carry it around Africa and into the Indian Ocean, where merchants and farmers encountered a new source of heat arriving from the west. In India, chili found a landscape already rich with complex traditions of seasoning. Black pepper, long pepper, ginger, mustard, turmeric, cardamom, and other ingredients had provided heat, aroma, and depth for centuries. Chile did not invent spicy Indian food. Instead, it entered existing culinary systems and proved remarkably adaptable. It could be grown locally rather than purchased through a long chain of distant merchants. It could be dried, ground, cooked into sauces, or combined with established spice mixtures. Over time, different regions adopted different varieties and techniques. Today, it is difficult to imagine many Indian dishes without chili. Yet the ingredient itself arrived only after Europeans had crossed the Atlantic. The same transformation continued east. Chilies entered Southeast Asia through maritime trade and were absorbed into cuisines that already used aromatic roots, herbs, pepper, and fermented seasonings. In what is now Thailand, they eventually became central to countless dishes. The sharp heat of a fresh bird's-eye chili can feel inseparable from Thai cooking, but the plant's distant ancestors came from the Americas. In China, chilies spread particularly well in inland regions where they became deeply associated with local food cultures. Sichuan cuisine is famous for combining chili heat with the distinctive numbing sensation of Sichuan pepper. Those two sensations now seem like natural partners, but they come from entirely different botanical histories. Sichuan pepper was native to Asia. Chili was an American newcomer. Farther east, Korea also adopted the new plant. Over time, red pepper became important in seasonings and fermented foods, including the evolving forms of kimchi. Modern Korean cuisine is visually filled with the deep red color of chili. Yet earlier Korean food existed without it. Within only a few centuries, an American plant had become so thoroughly integrated into Asian cuisines that its foreign origin became almost invisible. That may be the most remarkable part of the story. Chili did not simply replace older spices. It joined them. Local cooks decided how much to use, what to combine it with, and which varieties suited local tastes. Farmers selected plants that performed well in their climates. Generation after generation, a foreign crop became local knowledge. The transformation also shows how different the new global spice world was becoming. Earlier luxuries such as cloves and nutmeg gained much of their value because they grew naturally in extremely restricted places. Chili behaved differently. Once its seeds reached a suitable climate, farmers could produce it themselves. The flavor could travel without the old monopoly. And so the search for Asian spices produced one of history's great culinary ironies. Portuguese and Spanish sailors went to sea hoping to reach the spices of Asia. Their voyages connected the Americas to the wider world. Through those new routes, an American spice traveled east and helped transform the food of Asia itself. The ships had been searching for pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. What they carried back into the old spice world was something entirely new. And chili was not the only flavor crossing the Atlantic. As plants, people, empire, and cuisines moved between continents. The spice story was about to become an American story as well. Now the spice story turns toward the Atlantic. For centuries, Europe had looked east for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. After the voyages across the Atlantic, however, plants began moving in both directions, and the Americas became part of a new global exchange of flavor. Cinnamon and nutmeg arrived from the older spice world. Chili peppers traveled outward from the Americas. Vanilla followed a different path. It was native to Mexico and had long been known and used by indigenous peoples before Europeans encountered it. Allspice came from the Caribbean and Central America, where its dried berries offered an aroma that reminded Europeans of several familiar spices at once. In Caribbean ports and plantations, these ingredients met under conditions shaped by empire. Sugar became the dominant plantation commodity in many islands, and its expansion depended heavily on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. spices entered the same Atlantic world of ships, plantation, merchant, and coerced labor. Over time, crops, plantation, merchant, and coerced labor. Over time, crops once tied to Asia were transplanted into new tropical environments. Nutmeg, whose natural home had been the Banda Islands, eventually flourished in Grenada. The island became so closely associated with the spice that nutmeg would later become one of its most recognizable agricultural products. A tree once guarded by Dutch monopoly now grew on the other side of the planet. But the movement of plants was only part of what crossed the Atlantic. People carried ways of cooking. Indigenous American communities contributed crops and traditions already rooted in the Americas' chilies, maize, cacao, vanilla, and many other foods. Europeans brought their own preferences, preservation methods, livestock, grain, and demand for imported Asian spices. Enslaved Africans carried culinary knowledge from many regions of Africa, adapting familiar techniques to unfamiliar ingredients under brutal conditions. Asian foods and seasonings entered through expanding global trade. In colonial kitchens, these traditions met. A cook might combine an American chili with an African technique, a European ingredient, and a spice whose ancestors had grown in Asia. Recipes changed because ingredients changed. People substituted what was available for what they remembered. New combinations became familiar, then traditional. The Caribbean became one of the clearest examples. Spice blends brought together allspice, chilies, ginger, nutmeg, cinnamon, and other aromatics, with combinations shaped by each island's history. Food became a kind of historical record. A flavor could reveal a route across an ocean. A spice blend could contain traces of several continents. Something served at an ordinary table might carry the memory of indigenous agriculture, African survival, European colonization, and Asian commerce all at once. The Atlantic world also brought spices closer to the societies that would eventually become the United States. Colonial North American ports participated in networks connecting Britain, the Caribbean, Africa, and wider global trade. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and nutmeg entered households that could afford them. Imported spices found their way into drinks, baked foods, preserved dishes, and medicines. Gradually, flavors that had once announced extraordinary wealth became more familiar. The process was uneven, but the direction was clear. A nutmeg tree could grow in the Caribbean, an American chili in Asia, and cinnamon could cross the Atlantic in a commercial hold. The old map of spice origins had been broken open. Soon, another transformation would make distance shrink even further. Wooden sailing ships would give way to steam. A canal would cut through the land between the Mediterranean and Red Sea. Telegraph cables would allow information to travel faster than any merchant vessel. For thousands of years, distance had helped make spices precious. Now technology was beginning to attack distance itself. By the 19th century, the old geography of the spice trade was beginning to lose its power. For thousands of years, distance had helped make spices precious. A peppercorn from India or a nutmeg from a distant tropical island had once accumulated value with every sea crossing. Caravan road, warehouse, tax, and merchant between the grower and the buyer. Now the world was learning how to make those distances smaller. Steam was one of the great changes. Steamships could move with far greater regularity. Voyages became easier to schedule. Cargo could reach markets more predictably, and merchants no longer had to organize every journey around the same ancient rhythms that had guided sailors across the Indian Ocean for centuries. Then, in the late 19th century, the Suez Canal opened a new passage between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Ships traveling between Europe and the Indian Ocean no longer had to make the enormous voyage around the southern tip of Africa. The route that Portuguese navigators had spent generations discovering could now be bypassed by a narrow channel cut through Egypt. At almost the same moment, information began moving faster than cargo. Telegraph networks allowed merchants to learn about prices, harvests, shortages, and arrivals without waiting for a ship to carry a letter home. A trader could react to news from another continent with a speed that would have seemed impossible to the merchants of Venice or Alexandria. Industrial shipping carried greater quantities, while railways moved goods inland. Commercial networks became increasingly capable of supplying ordinary consumers, not only wealthy households. Meanwhile, the plants themselves had escaped their old boundaries. Cloves were cultivated beyond the Moluccas. Nutmeg grew beyond Banda. Pepper was produced in several tropical regions. Botanical gardens, colonial agriculture, transplanted seedlings, and commercial plantations had broken many of the geographical monopolies that once made individual islands so strategically important. Scarcity did not disappear completely. Harvests could fail. Wars could interrupt shipping. Weather could damage crops. But the old kind of scarcity was fading. A European ruler no longer needed access to one tiny island group to obtain nutmeg. Merchants could purchase supplies grown elsewhere. Pepper was still valuable, but it was becoming less like treasure and more like merchandise. That change altered the meaning of spice. For a Roman household, pepper could represent the astonishing reach of long-distance commerce. For a medieval noble, cinnamon and cloves displayed wealth. For a Dutch company, control of nutmeg could justify forts, fleets, and brutal monopoly. By the industrial age, the same substances were moving toward grocery shelves. The journey from luxury to commodity was not sudden. Fine spices could still be expensive, and colonial systems continued to exploit labor and land. Yet the long historical direction was unmistakable. Greater production and faster transport brought spices within reach of more people. The mystery faded too. Maps showed where the islands were. Botanical books described the plants. Merchants knew competing sources of supply. A clove was no longer an object rumored to come from a strange land guarded by fabulous creatures. It was an agricultural product that could be cultivated, shipped, wired, priced, and sold in enormous commercial networks. Distance had once created value. Technology was now compressing distance, and nowhere would the result become more ordinary or more revealing than in the kitchens of a growing nation across the Atlantic. In the United States, spices that had once belonged to kings, courts, and merchant fortunes were about to settle into cupboards, bakeries, holiday recipes, and everyday meals. The next chapter of the spice story would not begin in a royal palace or aboard a warship. It would begin at the American table. By the time spices settled into American kitchens, they had already crossed most of the world. In colonial North America, a household that opened a small jar of pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves was touching a trade network that stretched far beyond the Atlantic coast. These ingredients arrived through Atlantic commerce. Pepper still pointed back toward Asia. Cinnamon and cloves had traveled through old spice routes reshaped by European shipping. Nutmeg, once tied almost entirely to the Banda Islands, was becoming available from new tropical sources. They were imported goods, but gradually they became familiar parts of colonial cooking. Nutmeg was especially prized. It could be grated into drinks, custards, sauces, and baked dishes. Cinnamon found a natural home beside fruit and sugar. Ginger and cloves appeared in cakes, puddings, preserved foods, and warm drinks. Black pepper, less sweet and ceremonial, moved steadily toward the everyday table. The Atlantic sugar and molasses trade helped create another layer of flavor. Molasses entered breads, cakes, cookies, and puddings, where ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg could provide warmth and fragrance. Gingerbread, with older European roots, adapted easily to American ingredients and tastes. Over generations, some combinations became so familiar that their global origins almost disappeared from view. Apples, grown widely in North America from varieties brought and developed through European settlement, met cinnamon from Asia. Pumpkins and other squashes native to the Americas were combined with imported spices such as cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg. Eventually, those aromas became closely associated with autumn and Thanksgiving. The result feels deeply American. Yet the spice cabinet tells a more complicated story. A Thanksgiving pie can bring together an indigenous American crop, European baking traditions, Caribbean or Atlantic sugar, and spices whose histories lead back toward Asia and the Indian Ocean. During the 19th and 20th centuries, that map of flavor became larger. Immigration brought people who did not arrive with empty culinary memories. They carried recipes, preferences, techniques, and ideas about what food should smell and taste like. When familiar ingredients were unavailable, cooks substituted. When they became available, importers and shopkeepers found ways to supply them. Italian immigrants expanded the presence of Mediterranean seasonings in American urban kitchens. Chinese communities created restaurants, markets, and food businesses that introduced wider audiences to different sources, aromatics, and regional traditions. In the Southwest and across communities shaped by Mexican migration and long Mexican history, chili traditions connected the United States to a much older American story of capsicum. Later, immigration from India brought spice mixtures and ingredients that made the ancient spice landscapes of South Asia newly visible in American neighborhoods. Caribbean communities carried traditions shaped by allspice, chilies, ginger, nutmeg, and the long history of Atlantic exchange. Middle Eastern immigrants brought culinary worlds in which cinnamon, cumin, cardamom, pepper, and other aromatics had traveled for centuries. Asian grocery stores, neighborhood markets, and eventually large supermarkets widened access. Ingredients once difficult to find outside immigrant communities began appearing on ordinary shelves. The American spice cabinet slowly became a miniature map of global migration. Its contents did not arrive in one moment, and they did not come from one culture. They accumulated. A jar of oregano might sit beside cumin, cinnamon beside chili powder, turmeric beside paprika, black pepper, whose ancient journey once required monsoon sailors and Red Sea caravans, might stand in a disposable grinder beside the stove. That ordinariness is historically remarkable. The flavors that once marked royal banquets and merchant fortunes became ingredients a family could purchase during a weekly grocery trip. Yet becoming common did not erase their origins. It simply made the old roots harder to see. Behind an American supermarket shelf still stood farmers. Harvest seasons, processing plants, ports, ships, warehouses, and generations of culinary knowledge. The ancient chain had changed its shape, but it had never truly disappeared. And by the modern age, that chain was about to become faster, larger, and more invisible than ever. Today, the spice trade is quieter than it once was. No fleet waits outside a fortified island to seize a nutmeg harvest. No merchant in Alexandria needs to guess where cloves grow. Instead, the modern spice world moves through farms, processing plants, container ports, highways, warehouses, and supermarket aisles. Black pepper may begin on a farm in Vietnam, India, Indonesia, or another tropical producer. The berries are harvested, dried, cleaned, graded, and packed for shipment. Cinnamon bark is harvested and dried into quills or processed into powder. Nutmeg seeds are separated and prepared for market. Clove buds are picked before they open and dried until they become the familiar dark spice. Turmeric rhizomes are harvested from the soil, processed, dried, and ground into a brilliant yellow powder. Paprika begins with peppers that are dried and milled. The work is still agricultural before it is industrial. Someone must know when to harvest. Someone must spread pepper berries or cloves to dry. Someone must judge moisture, quality, and damage. From there, the scale changes, and an ancient trade enters a modern machine. Bags and boxes enter modern logistics systems. Trucks carry them toward ports. Containers join thousands of others aboard enormous ships. A shipment can cross an ocean as one small part of a vessel carrying goods from hundreds of industries. At the destination, spices move again through importers, processors, distributors, and warehouses. Still others disappear into blends. A jar of curry powder may combine spices with histories rooted in several regions. Pumpkin pie spice gathers aromas that Americans now associate with autumn. Chili powder, garam masala, Cajun seasoning, taco seasoning, and countless other mixtures turn global histories into convenient combinations that can be opened with one hand beside a stove. Then the jar reaches a shelf. At Walmart, a neighborhood grocery store, or a small local market. A shopper picks it up, scans a barcode, pays a few dollars, and takes it home. The transaction lasts seconds. That may be the greatest contrast in the entire history of spices. A product that once passed through merchant after merchant, crossed seas according to seasonal winds, traveled by caravan, and accumulated mystery with every mile, can now disappear into a shopping cart beside milk, bread, and paper towels. Yet the old chain has not vanished. Behind the jar is still a farmer. Behind the farmer is a harvest. Then comes drying, cleaning, processing, exporting, shipping, warehousing, distribution, and the store. The chain is still there. It has simply become difficult to see. Modern transportation has hidden distance behind reliability. Packaging has hidden the plant behind a label. Grinding has hidden the seed. Bark, ruet, fruit, or flower bud behind a uniform powder. But open the jar, and the older world briefly returns. The sharp scent of pepper still comes from berries grown on a climbing vine. Cinnamon is still bark. Cloves are still unopened flower buds. Nutmeg is still the seed inside a fruit. Turmeric still begins underground. The objects have changed less than the systems surrounding them. And so, after thousands of years, we can return to the quiet kitchen where this story began. The cabinet is still there. The pepper grinder is still waiting on the table. Only now, when we reach for it, the journey behind that ordinary little spice is no longer quite so invisible. And now, after all those oceans, ports, islands, empire, and centuries, we return to where we began. It is late at night in an ordinary American kitchen. The house is quiet. The cabinet door opens, and inside are the same familiar jars: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, paprika. On the table sits a pepper grinder. Pick it up, and for a moment it is only an object in your hand. But now imagine following a single peppercorn backward. Before it reached this kitchen, it sat beneath the lights of a grocery store. Before that, it waited in a warehouse, arrived by truck, crossed an ocean inside a container, and passed through a busy port. Before the container was sealed, the pepper had been cleaned, dried, sorted, and packed. And before any of that, there was a farm. There was warm air and damp earth. There were pepper vines climbing their supports beneath tropical leaves. There was monsoon rain falling across the landscape, just as it had fallen for generations before anyone in Europe knew what a pepper vine looked like. Keep traveling backward, and the modern world begins to disappear. The container ship becomes a steamship, then a sailing vessel. Warehouses become older warehouses. A British merchant gives way to a Dutch trader counting sacks beside a ledger. Behind him stands the world of the VOC, with its ships and monopolies. Go farther back, and a Portuguese carrack is rounding Africa, carrying pepper toward Lisbon. Earlier still, a Venetian galley waits in the Mediterranean. Merchants bargain in Alexandria. Cargo moves toward the Nile and Red Sea. A Roman cook crushes pepper into a sauce while, far away, another sack begins its journey from India. And before Rome, before Venice, before Portugal, before anyone imagined a global spice empire, there was an Indian Ocean sailor watching the stars and waiting for the monsoon wind. Behind him was the farmer. Behind the farmer was the vine. All of it is there, hidden inside something small enough to roll across your palm. That is the long pattern beneath the history of spices. Distance created scarcity. Scarcity created value. Value encouraged trade. Trade created routes. Those routes connected villages, ports, cities, and continents. Competition for them helped build fortunes and empires, and eventually new ships, transplanted crops, canals, railways, telegraphs, and modern logistics made the distances smaller. The spices themselves became ordinary. That may be their greatest transformation. Pepper no longer needs to announce wealth when it reaches the table. Nutmeg no longer makes a tiny island worth fighting over. Cinnamon can be sprinkled over breakfast without anyone wondering what mysterious forest produced it. Yet ordinary does not mean without history. The cabinet in front of us is a quiet archive of human movement. Cinnamon carries the memory of ancient trade. Nutmeg recalls distant islands and the struggle to control them. Chili remembers the Americas and the great exchange that transformed cuisines across Asia. Pepper carries perhaps the longest trail of all. From the monsoon forests of India through the markets and kitchens of civilizations thousands of miles away. And now, someone is preparing dinner. There are no merchant fleets outside the window. No caravan is crossing a desert. No sailor is waiting for the wind to reverse. The kitchen is warm. The plate is ready, and the pepper grinder turns once above it. A few dark fragments fall onto the food. That is all. Something that once crossed oceans and passed through empires has become dinner. And perhaps that is the strangest part of the history of spices. After thousands of years of trade, voyages, fortunes, monopolies, migration, and empires, we have returned to the reason the story began in the first place. Somewhere, a very long time ago, someone sat beside a fire, tasted their food, and decided it could use just a little something more.